The night settles over the memory of an empire that once glowed like a perfectly polished marble statue. Rome at its height feels almost unreal now. Roads stretched out in every direction. Laws stacked neatly like alphabetized scrolls. Markets buzzing with life. Armies marching in formation, so precise they could probably align the stars if someone asked nicely. Everything looked steady, balanced, and very sure of itself. The kind of confidence usually reserved for people who have never once misplaced their keys. For a long moment, the empire seems frozen inside its golden age. Pax Romana. A long, slow breath of peace that lasted so long, people probably assumed it was a permanent feature of the universe. Cities thrived. Merchants haggled. Officials pretended they were the ones keeping the whole machine running. Even the streets seemed to hum with the rhythm of a place convinced tomorrow would behave exactly as planned. But the quiet of a warm evening often carries a different type of sound if you listen closely. Not sharp, not alarming, just the gentle shift of something changing far away, the way a distant breeze brushes the tops of trees before anyone notices the wind. Rome, wrapped in its own sense of order, did not pay attention. Why would it? When you are the largest and loudest presence on the continent, it is easy to mistake silence for stability. Yet somewhere beyond the borders, where the empire's perfect roads ended and the wild pathways of other peoples began, small movements were already forming. Riders traveling across grasslands, families migrating for reasons of their own, tribes exchanging stories around fires, unaware that future historians would eventually blame them for everything from collapsing frontiers to ruining architecture. Nothing dramatic had happened yet, no walls shaken, no cities threatened. The empire still stood wide awake, calm and unbothered. But if Rome had paused for a moment and taken a deeper breath, perhaps it might have felt that faint shift on the edge of its world, a whisper of change that did not ask for attention but carried the quiet certainty that history was preparing to rearrange itself. For now, though, the night remains still. The empire rests in its confident glow, unaware that the first crack has already begun to form far beyond what the lamplight can reach. The night drifts over the map of Europe in the late 3rd century, soft and slow, the way a thin layer of mist curls around distant hills before anyone notices it's there. If Rome had been listening closely during this time, it might have heard the gentle creaking of its own foundation shifting, like an old wooden chair that still looks sturdy but makes one unsettling sound every time you sit down. Nothing catastrophic yet, nothing dramatic, but the kind of quiet discomfort that suggests something somewhere isn't quite right. For centuries, the empire had been running with the confidence of a system that believed it could outlast time itself. But by the late 200s, even the calmest observer would have noticed that Rome was beginning to lose its balance. The economy wasn't simply troubled, it was behaving like a stubborn mule that refused to move no matter how many officials poked it. Coins were being minted with less silver than before. Prices climbed. People grumbled. Markets wavered. And no one, not even the most optimistic senator on his best day, could pretend the situation felt normal. Political life didn't help. The throne of Rome during this era was less a position of honor and more a revolving door with exceptionally poor job security. Emperors rose and fell so frequently that updating statues could have been a full-time profession. One leader would take charge, declare he had everything under control, and then promptly be replaced by someone else who claimed he would absolutely fix whatever the previous person had messed up. It was an exhausting cycle, and at some point, even the marble busts of emperors must have wondered whether it was worth memorizing the new names. Meanwhile, the military was experiencing a kind of identity crisis. Rome's legendary legions, once known for their discipline, strength, and impressive ability to march long distances without complaining, were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Recruitment had become difficult. Loyalty was fading. Soldiers needed higher pay, better conditions, fewer unreasonable marching orders, and maybe an occasional day off. The borders grew longer, the threats grew sharper, and the empire's ability to manage everything all at once slowly thinned like old parchment. This period later came to be known as the crisis of the 3rd century, although if you had traveled back in time and told a Roman that, they might simply have nodded and said, "Yes, that sounds about right." Civil wars flared up like poorly controlled campfires. Generals fought each other as often as they fought external enemies. Regions tried declaring independence. Local leaders thought they could run things better on their own. It was chaos. But a very organized, Roman-style chaos that still tried its best to maintain clean, administrative paperwork. And then, just when things looked like they couldn't get messier, they absolutely did. Pressures at the borders increased. New groups were moving across the landscape. The weather changed, affecting crops and trade. Supplies fluctuated, population shifted. It wasn't a sudden crisis. It was a slow tightening of knots across every part of the empire's structure. And Rome, proud and vast, tried to act dignified while quietly sweating behind the scenes. That was when Diocletian appeared on stage, walking into the spotlight like someone who had just been handed the world's most chaotic to-do list. Becoming emperor in the middle of this historical storm was not the kind of job most people would want, but Diocletian was different. He took one look at the situation, nodded as if everything was perfectly manageable, and began reorganizing the empire with the precision of someone sorting a very large and very complicated spice cabinet. His reforms were sweeping, administrative borders were redrawn, provincial management was tightened, taxes were adjusted, standardized, reshaped, and, depending on whom you asked, either improved or made significantly more annoying. The army was expanded and reorganized, though expanded might be generous. It was more like pulling together every available troop, giving them a motivational speech and hoping for the best. Diocletian even divided imperial responsibilities into the tetrarchy, effectively splitting leadership across 4 rulers to prevent one person from being overwhelmed. Whether this made the empire more stable or just introduced more people who could disagree with each other is still up for debate. But even with all these reforms, the truth lingered in the shadows. Rome was changing, not collapsing, not yet, but shifting, adjusting, recalibrating, and trying to keep itself upright in a world that was no longer as predictable as it had once been. The empire's borders stretched like an overworked rope. Its institutions creaked under pressure, and the familiar rhythm of Roman life, markets, legions, roads, cities, began to hum in a slightly different key. If you stood on one of those borders at dusk, you might have felt it. A tiny tremor running through the air, a sense that the world beyond the frontier was moving in ways that the empire had not fully understood. A whisper of migrations beginning, of new alliances forming, of forces reshaping the edges of Europe. For now, though, the night remains calm. The stars hang quietly over the continent, and the Roman Empire, immense and magnificent, stands in the dim glow of evening, unaware that the first threads of its great tapestry have already started to loosen. The night stretches across the northern forests and wide plains beyond Rome, moving slowly the way a curtain drifts shut on a quiet stage. Out here, far from the stone roads and bustling markets of the empire, the world breathes differently. The air feels wilder, the land is broader, and the people who lived in these distant spaces, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, and many others, moved with rhythms that Rome never fully understood. If the empire had listened closely, it might have realized these tribes weren't mysterious villains waiting in the shadows. They were simply living their own lives in their own ways, on their own time. History just eventually put them all on a collision course. To begin with, calling them barbarians was mostly a Roman habit. It was a convenient label, like putting everything unfamiliar into a single drawer and hoping no one would ask you to organize it. These groups were incredibly diverse. Some farmed, some herded, some migrated seasonally, some stayed put more than Rome ever expected. The Gothic peoples, for instance, were skilled farmers and horse riders who built their own communities with clear social structures. The Vandals had a talent for traveling long distances without losing their sense of direction. The Franks were organized, practical, and unbothered by the idea of long, cold winters. And the Saxons, living along the rugged coasts, balanced farming, raiding, and maritime life with a kind of stubborn determination that would one day shape entire kingdoms. Their worlds were mobile, flexible, and adaptable in ways Roman society often wasn't. Some tribes lived in sturdy wooden houses, others in tents that could be packed up, moved, and rebuilt before Rome had even finished its morning paperwork. Livestock moved with the seasons. Communities shifted with opportunity. It wasn't chaos, it was a different kind of order, tuned to the landscape rather than a central capital. A Roman official might have looked at this lifestyle and felt quietly stressed, wondering where he was supposed to send tax forms if the entire village had moved to a new valley overnight. But even these tribes, practical as they were, faced pressures that would eventually push them toward Rome's borders. Climate changes altered grazing lands. Harsh winters arrived more often. Droughts affected harvests. Rivers shifted. Forests thinned. Population growth created new needs. A single difficult season could force entire communities to migrate, searching for safer ground, better resources, or simply a place where survival didn't feel like an ongoing negotiation with nature. Then came the pressure from the east. Fast, sharp, and undeniable. Groups like the Alans and Sarmatians had pushed westward before, but nothing compared to what would happen later. The early waves of eastern nomads nudged neighboring tribes slightly, like a gentle tap on the shoulder. But these small movements accumulated over time, setting off ripples across the continent. No one intended to start a chain reaction. People were simply trying to adapt. Yet each shift displaced another tribe, which then displaced another, until all these movements slowly began pointing toward the Roman frontier. This was the quiet beginning of what historians now call the migration period. But to the people living through it, it wasn't a grand historical moment. It was just life happening, one decision at a time. A tribe moved because winter lasted too long. Another left because pasture land became scarce. Others gathered allies because they sensed danger approaching from unfamiliar riders on the eastern horizon. One small choice here, another there. And soon thousands of people were traveling together. Families, elders, warriors, herders, merchants, carrying everything they owned and hoping the next place would be kinder than the last. If you imagine these movements at night, lit only by scattered fires across the plains, they feel almost peaceful. Groups sleeping under open skies, horses tied close, children wrapped in furs, leaders discussing routes by starlight. There was no intention to menace Rome. Most tribes had no idea the empire even cared about them. They simply walked toward safety, warmer lands, and better opportunities. Rome just happened to be in the way. And yet, from the Roman perspective, things looked very different. The empire was accustomed to predictable borders and predictable neighbors. Seeing whole communities moving together, sometimes tens of thousands strong, felt like watching the landscape itself shift. Soldiers stationed at the frontiers might have stared at the horizon, wondering whether the earth had always been that full of people. Roman administrations tried negotiating, assigning land, demanding loyalty, and occasionally panicking in a dignified way. But the truth was simple. They had never seen migration on this scale before. These tribes weren't armies in the traditional sense. They weren't dressed in identical uniforms, nor did they march in neat lines. Their strength came from mobility, adaptability, and the ability to turn a challenge into an opportunity faster than Rome could finish scheduling a meeting. When danger appeared, they moved. When land opened, they settled. When conflict arose, they formed alliances with unexpected speed. Their resilience made them unpredictable, and unpredictability was something Rome had never been good at managing. But perhaps the most quietly humorous part of this entire situation is that none of the tribes were actively planning to topple a massive empire. The Goths weren't sitting around campfires designing long-term strategies about how to break Roman defenses. The Vandals weren't drawing maps with dramatic red arrows. The Franks weren't plotting to take over Gaul while sipping warm drinks in the snow. They were mostly thinking about food, shelter, herds, survival, and where the next winter wind might blow. History, however, has a talent for turning ordinary human decisions into events that reshape continents. Each tribe moved for its own reasons. Each family walked one step at a time. And slowly, unknowingly, they edged closer to a world that had been standing still for far too long. Rome believed its borders were permanent, but the tribes approaching from beyond the rivers and forests were not obstacles. They were momentum, and momentum always finds a way forward. As the night deepens over these distant landscapes, the fires of countless camps glow softly across fields and valleys. Horses shift in the darkness. People sleep in quiet clusters, wrapped against the cold. Leaders consider the coming days. No one knows exactly where they're headed. No one predicts the encounters to come, but something is undeniably in motion. A gentle, steady migration that will eventually press against the heart of the ancient world. For now, though, it is simply night. Quiet, slow, unhurried. The world rests under a wide sky, unaware that these small movements of people, these families following instinct, hope, and survival, will one day push directly into the path of an empire that believed nothing could ever truly change. The night settles over the eastern steppes with a long, unhurried sigh. The grasslands stretch so far that even the moon seems a little unsure where the horizon actually begins. Out here, the air is thin, the wind is sharp, and the world feels vast enough to hold entire migrations without anyone noticing for a while. But eventually someone always notices. And for the tribes living west of these endless plains, Goths, Alans, Vandals, and many others, The moment of noticing arrived when the first distant thunder of hooves echoed across the steppe. Quiet at first, almost polite, the kind of sound you mistake for weather. But this wasn't weather, this was movement. Fast, precise, and headed in their direction. The riders were the Huns. If history had a moment where someone whispered, oh, under their breath, this was probably it. The Huns were unlike anything Europe had seen. They moved with the speed of wind-fed fire, sweeping across the steppes, with a confidence that suggested they were used to covering distances faster than most people could finish breakfast. Their horses were small but powerful, the kind that looked as if they'd keep running even if you politely asked them to stop. Their archers could shoot while riding at full speed, turning and twisting with a grace that made seasoned European soldiers stare and reconsider their life choices. But the Huns didn't begin as conquerors. They were, first and foremost, nomads, people shaped by motion, by open land, by the constant need to adapt. They traveled with families, herds, and belongings strapped to wagons that rolled as easily across grass as ships glide across water. Their world was one of movement, wind, long horizons, and decisions made quickly because the weather rarely waited for anyone. They dressed in felt and furs. They ate what the land provided. They lived with a resilience forged by seasons that could be harsh enough to make even stone reconsider its solidity. To people who had never encountered steppe life, this way of being felt almost supernatural in its efficiency, though really it was just the result of generations learning to read the land the way others read maps. The Huns knew when to ride, when to rest, when to strike, and when to vanish into the grasslands so completely that their enemies were left staring at empty fields, wondering if they had imagined everything. Meanwhile, in the forests and farmlands farther west, the Gothic tribes were living in relative calm. They farmed, raised livestock, traded with Rome, and did what most people do. Focus on the next season, the next harvest, the next small problem that felt important in the moment. No one was prepared for news of riders coming from the east. The first rumors probably sounded like exaggerated travel stories. They shoot arrows backward. They never dismount. They eat while riding. They sleep in their saddles. It might have felt like someone was inventing a new kind of folk tale just to get attention. But the stories kept coming. More tribes fled from lands farther east, seeking refuge. They carried warnings, fear, and sometimes nothing else. They described encounters with riders who moved so fast they seemed to appear from nowhere. Leaders who struck hard and negotiated harder. Warriors who fought not in lines or formations, but in fluid, shifting waves that confused even battle-tested armies. By the time the Goths finally realized the threat was real, the Huns were already too close for comfort. The first real shock wasn't a battle. It was the sudden, overwhelming pressure of displacement. When a nomadic wave moves, it pushes everything in its path forward. The tribes east of the Goths had been pushed. Now the Goths felt the pressure. Families packed what they could, farmers abandoned fields, entire communities gathered at the rivers, discussing where to go. It wasn't panic, yet. But it was a kind of deep unease, the kind that settles in your bones and makes the nights feel longer than usual. And then the second shock came. The Huns arrived. Not as a gentle knock on the door, but as a force of movement, fast, coordinated, and relentless. Their riders swept across the plains like a living storm. They didn't match Rome's structured army manuals. They didn't follow the proper rules of European warfare. They didn't politely wait in lines for battle to start. They attacked swiftly, retreated swiftly, and returned even faster. which was terribly inconsiderate for anyone trying to maintain a stable frontier. The Goths had a decision to make: stay and resist an enemy built for speed and adaptability, or move, as so many others before them already had. They moved. Entire Gothic groups gathered along the Danube River, staring across the water toward Roman territory. It must have been a surreal moment, thousands of people looking at an empire they had traded with, served in, and sometimes fought alongside, now begging for permission to cross the border as refugees. Rome, already fraying at its edges, suddenly found itself facing something it had never anticipated: a displaced nation asking for safety from an enemy Rome didn't understand. But Rome hesitated, negotiated, complicated. The empire liked procedures, paperwork, requirements, long discussions about land, food, rights, and loyalty. Meanwhile, the Huns did not wait politely while Rome filled out forms. Their presence kept pressing westward, adding urgency to every decision. The chain reaction had begun. Hun pressure, Gothic displacement, Roman hesitation, a mass of desperate people stuck between an unstoppable force and an unwelcoming frontier. It was a historical traffic jam of enormous proportions. Eventually, Rome allowed the Goths to cross, though under strict supervision. Food was promised, protection was promised, land was promised. The execution, however, went about as well as trying to assemble furniture without instructions. Corruption spread, supplies vanished, officials strained relationships, tensions rose, and the Goths, hungry, mistreated, and increasingly aware they had traded one threat for another, began to turn restless. Somewhere in this mix, someone must have muttered something like, "This is not going to end well." They were correct. Because from the east, the Huns kept pushing forward, reshaping everything behind them. They split Gothic groups. They redirected Vandal migrations. They moved Alans. They pressured the Suebi. They nudged the Burgundians. The Franks braced themselves. The Roman frontier bent under the strain. These movements weren't small. They were entire populations, shifting like tectonic plates. The Huns themselves were not always present, but their influence was everywhere. Their arrival changed the balance of power across the continent. They disrupted old alliances. They created new ones. They forced tribes who once considered each other enemies to suddenly consider being friends, at least temporarily. When you face a threat that moves at the speed of a moving storm cloud, cooperation starts sounding like a reasonable idea. Rome watched all this in a state of confusion, resilience, and mild existential dread. The empire had spent centuries believing its borders were unshakable, its power unquestioned, and its neighbors predictable. But these new movements didn't follow traditional patterns. The Huns weren't settling down. They weren't negotiating long-term treaties yet. They weren't attacking Rome directly, at least not at first. They simply rearranged the edges of the continent until everything that once felt stable now felt slightly tilted. If you were a Roman living at the frontier around this time, you might have gone to sleep one night staring across an empty landscape and woken up a week later to find a large Gothic camp across the river and rumors of fast-moving riders somewhere behind them. It must have been like watching waves form on a quiet lake and realizing too late that something bigger was stirring beneath the surface. The Huns didn't bring the collapse of the Roman world overnight. They brought momentum. They brought pressure. They set off a chain reaction so vast that even they couldn't fully control where it led. Tribes moved west. Conflict followed migration. Rome tried to manage everything at once, and managed almost nothing fully. And the Goths, once simple farmers and warriors living north of the Black Sea, were now caught between survival and empire, making decisions that would eventually lead them deep into Roman territory, toward battles Rome never wanted but could no longer avoid. As the night deepens over the steppes, the fires of nomadic camps glow in soft orange circles. Riders tend their horses, families share quiet meals, children sleep under firs. The world looks peaceful, almost deceptively so. But beneath this stillness, something enormous is shifting. The Huns have arrived. History is moving, and the Roman Empire far to the west is about to feel the first distant tremor of a storm galloping in from the edge of the known world. The night settles over the Balkan hills with a softness that feels almost polite, as though the darkness itself understands what happened on this land and prefers to approach quietly. The grass bends gently in the evening breeze. The sky glows faintly with the last touch of daylight. Nothing in this peaceful scene hints at the chaos, the confusion, or the catastrophic miscalculation that unfolded here centuries ago. But history remembers, and if you listen long enough, the silence carries the faint echo of hoofbeats, shouts, and decisions that came a moment too late. To understand the story of Adrianople, you must first picture the world as it was in 378. Rome was still powerful, still proud, still convinced it could handle any situation with enough discipline, armor, and sternly written reports. Emperor Valens ruled the eastern half of the empire, a man eager to prove his competence and equally eager not to be overshadowed by his nephew, Gratian, who ruled in the west. Valens wasn't reckless, but he had a certain impatience that sometimes made his advisors wish he would slow down, breathe, and maybe think about things for more than 5 seconds before making decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. The Goths, meanwhile, were not invaders by choice. They had fled across the Danube to escape the Huns, hoping for safety, land, and a fresh start under Roman rule. But Rome, overwhelmed and a bit disorganized, failed to support them properly. Supplies were mismanaged, corruption was rampant. Gothic families starved while Roman officials made questionable choices involving food distribution and bribes. Tensions rose, anger simmered, and eventually patience broke. Imagine thousands of frustrated families, warriors, elders, and children moving together in an enormous camp that traveled across the land like a restless tide. They wanted peace, they wanted fairness, they wanted stability. What they got instead was betrayal. And betrayal, historically speaking, has a habit of leading people toward conflict. By the time Valens marched out to confront the Gothic forces, the situation was already far more complicated than he realized. His scouts gave him unreliable information. His allies were delayed. His officers disagreed. And somewhere in all this confusion, Valens made the fateful decision to fight immediately rather than wait for reinforcements from Gratian. Maybe he wanted to prove he could win without help. Maybe he trusted the wrong messenger. Maybe he simply woke up that morning with too much confidence and not enough caution. Whatever the reason, the decision would change the course of Roman history. The morning of the battle was likely deceptively calm. Roman soldiers assembled in long, disciplined lines, their armor catching the sunlight in sharp silver flashes. They had marched far in intense summer heat, and many were tired, sweating, and mildly annoyed. The Gothic wagon circle, where families, supplies, and non-combatants gathered, stood on the hills ahead like a small, stubborn fortress. The Romans thought victory would come swiftly, After all, they had faced tribal armies before. They trusted their organization, their drilling, their shields, their formations. What they didn't realize was that the Gothic cavalry, fast, fierce, and absolutely essential, was not yet present on the field. They were away, foraging for food and scouting the surrounding terrain. Valens assumed he had caught the Goths at a disadvantage. A perfect moment, an easy win, a low-risk opportunity to shine. But the universe, in its vast sense of humor, had other ideas. The Romans advanced under the scorching afternoon sun. The air shimmered with heat. Dust rose under thousands of marching feet. Orders were shouted, formations shifted. And just as the battle began to unfold, the Gothic cavalry suddenly returned, thundering across the plains, in a wave of motion that must have made the front lines of the Roman army seriously reconsider their career choices. The timing could not have been worse for Valens. The Roman infantry was already engaged. The formations were stretched thin. Communication broke down. And the cavalry returning to the Gothic lines didn't slip in quietly. They struck like a hammer. A fast-moving, highly motivated hammer wielded by riders who knew exactly how to use speed as a weapon. The Roman left wing collapsed first, not gracefully, not slowly. It folded like someone forgetting how to stand while trying to balance a heavy box. Soldiers were overwhelmed by the sudden impact of horsemen sweeping into their ranks. Shields clattered, lines broke, panic spread faster than orders could travel, and in ancient warfare, once a formation breaks, it rarely recovers. Valens, in the midst of this chaos, realized too late that the situation had spiraled beyond control. Messages were sent, orders were shouted, but the battlefield had become a storm of dust, sweat, fear, and noise. No one could hear, no one could see clearly. The Gothic infantry pushed from the front. The Gothic cavalry flanked from the sides. Roman units found themselves trapped in a tightening circle with no room to maneuver. Some soldiers fought bravely, others tried to flee. Most found themselves crushed together so tightly that the heat alone became deadly. Historical accounts describe men suffocating, trampled, or unable to lift their arms because the crowd was too dense. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a collapse, a slow, crushing implosion of the Roman line. Valens himself disappeared in the chaos. Some say he died fighting. Others claim he was wounded, carried to a farmhouse, and then burned, when the building was set on fire accidentally or deliberately. The truth remains uncertain, swallowed by the confusion of that day. What is certain is that he never returned, and Rome lost not only an emperor, but most of its eastern field army. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Bodies sprawled across the plains, armor shattered, weapons broken. The summer sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over a scene of devastation that Rome had not experienced in generations. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a shockwave. Historians like Edward Gibbon would later call Adrianople a fatal wound, an event so severe that Rome never fully recovered. And he wasn't exaggerating. The loss of so many experienced soldiers weakened the empire's defenses permanently. The Goths were no longer just displaced migrants. They were now a force Rome had to negotiate with, sometimes even rely on. The Eastern Empire struggled to rebuild its troops. The balance of power shifted. The frontier lines that once seemed firm dissolved like sand underwater. The aftermath rippled across the empire. Generals questioned long-held tactics. Politicians debated reforms. Armies everywhere realized that the world was changing faster than traditional strategies could keep up. Rome, once the unstoppable giant, had met an opponent who fought differently, more fluid, more adaptable, and more determined than the empire expected. It was as if the old rule book had been tossed out the window, and everyone was scrambling to write a new one. And yet, amid the heavy consequences of the battle, there is a strangely human layer of irony. Valens had rushed into combat hoping for a quick, glorious victory. Instead, he found a disaster so complete that his name became permanently tied to one of the most devastating defeats in Roman military history. If history had a way of leaving notes, the one left at Adrianople would probably read something like, "Next time, wait for reinforcements." As night fully descends over the fields where the battle once raged, the land grows quiet again. The grass sways gently, unaware of the weight it holds in memory. The hills stand unchanged. The wind moves softly across the plains. There is no sound of hooves now, no clash of shields, no shouts of men facing impossible odds. Only calm, only stillness, only the long sleep of a place that once witnessed the moment an empire's confidence broke. And in this silence, you can almost imagine history itself, exhaling, settling into the earth, and waiting patiently for the next traveler to pause, listen, and feel the distant heartbeat of a world that changed on a single summer afternoon, centuries ago. The night drifts gently across the Roman countryside, settling on rooftops, riverbanks, and quiet barracks with the kind of softness that makes everything look more peaceful than it actually is. Somewhere in this calm darkness, Rome has just made a decision that feels, on the surface, wise and practical. A treaty with the Goths, a way to restore order, a moment to breathe. A fragile pause in a world that has been rattled by chaos. If someone had walked through the empire at this precise moment, they might have thought, things are finally settling down. And the universe, overhearing this comment, would have probably raised an eyebrow. After the catastrophe at Adrianople, Rome understood it needed a new strategy. Fighting the Goths again would be costly, risky, exhausting. Negotiation, on the other hand, seemed doable, reasonable, civilized. The empire had worked with tribal groups before, it wasn't new. And so Rome extended an offer: land within imperial borders, food, assistance, and a place to start over. Under certain conditions, of course. The empire liked conditions and rules, and agreements written on very official-looking documents. The Goths, weary from years of displacement, conflict, broken promises, and near starvation, accepted. But their acceptance wasn't the triumphant handshake moment Rome might have imagined. It was more like a tired nod from people who had run out of options. They didn't want to overthrow anything. They wanted homes, harvests, and a sense of stability. A chance to raise children without scanning the horizon for horsemen every 10 minutes. With the treaty signed, the Goths became what Rome called foederati, allied peoples living within the empire while maintaining their own leaders and internal structures. In return, they owed military service to Rome, a sort of part-time job arrangement, except with significantly more weapons and significantly fewer scheduled breaks. To Rome, this seemed like a clever solution. The empire needed soldiers. The Goths needed land. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a few things, as it turned out. To begin with, integrating an entire migrating nation into the empire was not as simple as drawing a border on a map and saying, "Here, this is yours now." The Goths arrived in large numbers. Families, warriors, elders, livestock, all settling on land that Romans had long considered their own. Local populations stared at the newcomers the way people stare at unexpected guests who show up with luggage and a long-term mindset. There were misunderstandings, disagreements, occasional arguments about grazing space, food distribution, and whose goats had wandered into whose vineyards. The Roman administration, already strained and recovering from recent disaster, struggled to keep up. Supplies didn't always arrive on time. Promises made by officials weren't always honored. Corruption crept in quietly, the way it always seems to do when there's too much responsibility and not enough oversight. Some Roman officers realized they could profit from controlling Gothic resources and did so with enthusiasm that would later be remembered unfavorably. The Goths noticed. They weren't oblivious. They saw the missing grain. They heard the whispered deals. They felt the tension simmering in communities where trust was supposed to grow. And yet, for a while, both sides tried, really tried, to make it work. Rome trained Gothic warriors. Gothic leaders advised Roman generals. There were moments of cooperation, strange friendships, and brief periods when it seemed like this unusual partnership might hold. But beneath this surface cooperation, something far larger was brewing. Rome had always believed it could absorb and reorganize anyone. It was part of the empire's personality, confident, structured, occasionally overbearing. The idea of sharing power, even a small amount, made some officials uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the Goths, still carrying the trauma of displacement and nearly being wiped out, were cautious, alert, and increasingly aware that they held leverage. Rome needed them more than they needed Rome. It was a realization that changed the balance quietly, like sand shifting under a foundation no one bothered to inspect. The word federati looked neat on parchment, but in reality it meant thousands of people who owed loyalty to Rome, except when they didn't. They fought alongside Roman armies, except when they disagreed with Roman leaders. They accepted Roman land, but kept their own laws, chieftains, and priorities. It was cooperation, yes, but cooperation held together with improvised knots and hopeful thinking. And then there was the fact that the Gothic warriors were good, not adequate good, not helpful volunteers good. They were extremely good, experienced from years of fighting for survival, highly mobile and fiercely loyal to their own people. Roman generals respected them, sometimes depended on them, sometimes feared what might happen if they ever stopped cooperating. And that fear, even unspoken, added tension to every interaction. As the months turned into years, problems accumulated. Small conflicts grew into larger disputes. Roman governors made poor decisions. Gothic leaders grew frustrated. Miscommunication spread. And somewhere inside this fragile arrangement, the seeds of something darker took root. Seeds of resentment, seeds of mistrust. Seeds that would one day blossom into actions Rome would never be able to fully control. Yet for now, just for this moment in the story, there is calm. You can almost imagine a quiet evening in a Gothic settlement on Roman soil, fires glowing softly, children asleep, warriors sharpening weapons, not for rebellion but for routine. Roman officers riding by trying to look confident about everything. Fields ready for harvest, livestock grazing, a strange balance holding the night together. Rome believes it has bought itself time. The Goths believe they have found a place to rebuild, and the world, watching from the shadows, knows the time buys nothing without trust. But trust is fragile, and the empire, still recovering from Adrianople, still stretched thin, still full of contradictions, does not know that this temporary peace is the soft pause before a storm that will shake its foundations. For now, though the night remains still, the treaty is signed, the borders are quiet, Rome sleeps, believing the danger is past, and the Goths, wrapped in the gentle calm of a rare, peaceful evening, rest in the lands they hoped would finally give them safety. Neither side realizes that the storm is already forming just beyond the edges of that calm. A storm born not from hatred or ambition, but from hunger, frustration, broken promises, and misunderstandings that will grow larger than any document could hold. The wind moves lightly across the fields, carrying no warnings yet. Only the soft sound of leaves brushing against one another, like the faint whisper of history preparing to turn its next page. The night folds gently over the Italian peninsula, drifting across hills, valleys, and ancient roads worn smooth by centuries of Roman footsteps. Under this soft darkness, history begins to shift again, slowly, cautiously, the way a door creaks open when no one is expecting visitors. And walking quietly through that doorway is a man who did not set out to become Rome's nemesis. He did not picture himself in dramatic paintings or stern textbooks. He wanted fairness, respect, perhaps even partnership. But Rome, being Rome, made all of that complicated. His name was Alaric. To understand why Alaric eventually led his people to the gates of Rome, not once, not twice, but 3 times, you have to picture the strange, awkward relationship between the Empire and the Goths in the decades after Adrianople. It was a relationship filled with unmet expectations, mixed messages, broken promises, and the kind of tension that would make even experienced diplomats want to lie down and take a nap. When the dust of the great battle finally settled, the Goths had not vanished. They had not been defeated, absorbed, or reorganized. They were still there, moving across Roman lands, surviving the best they could while carrying the memory of betrayal, hunger, and loss. Rome needed them, but didn't trust them. The Goths cooperated, but did not forget. It was like watching 2 neighbors who politely greet each other in the morning, but both secretly know. One of them accidentally ran over the other's vegetable garden last year. Alaric grew up in this world, a world caught between empire and tribe, between cooperation and resentment. He was Gothic by birth, Roman by upbringing, and something else entirely by temperament. He served in the Roman military, learned Roman strategies, walked Roman streets, and watched Roman politics operate with its signature mixture of brilliance and complete bewilderment. He wasn't impressed, but he was observant. At heart, Alaric wanted what Rome kept promising but never fully delivering: a secure homeland for his people and fair treatment for the Gothic soldiers who had shed blood for the empire. Nothing extravagant, nothing unreasonable, just a place where the Goths could farm, raise families, and stop being treated like very large, very heavily armed house guests who had overstayed their welcome. Rome agreed, then disagreed, then agreed again, then forgot, then remembered, then changed its mind. And somewhere among these cycles of inconsistency, Alaric realized something. Rome wanted the benefit of Gothic strength, without giving them the dignity of belonging. He took that personally. But even then, he didn't immediately march toward rebellion. He tried negotiation. He tried diplomacy. He tried being reasonable, which is always harder when dealing with bureaucracies. He approached Roman officials with offers of service, requests for supplies, and suggestions for peaceful settlement. And Rome, ever confident in its own grandeur, responded with delays, mixed decisions, and occasionally the kind of polite dismissal that makes people reconsider their entire personality. Eventually, Alaric was elected Rex, king of the Visigoths. His people believed in him. They trusted his leadership, his vision, and his ability to navigate the messy world of Roman politics. And with this new authority, he approached the empire once more. Rome mishandled him again. And that is when history took a deep breath and decided to get interesting. The First Siege, 408 CE. Alaric didn't march into Italy like a conqueror. He arrived more like a frustrated business partner demanding overdue payments. His people had served Rome for decades. They had fought Rome's enemies. They had bled for Roman victories. And yet, when they requested payment, supplies, or land, basic things agreed upon in earlier treaties, Rome either stalled or made excuses that would have sounded flimsy even to someone half asleep. So Alaric gathered his warriors and walked toward Rome, not with the swagger of a villain, more with the slow, steady determination of someone who has finally had enough of corporate email chains and wants to speak to the manager in person. The Eternal City, shocked that anyone would dare approach with anything other than admiration, panicked. The Senate scrambled. Officials scurried like startled birds, and citizens whispered in markets, wondering whether this was the end of the world or simply a temporary inconvenience. Alaric surrounded the city but didn't attack. Not yet. He requested negotiations, supplies, a fair agreement. Rome refused to listen, so Alaric tightened the blockade. Grain shipments slowed, prices rose, people complained, loudly and creatively. Eventually, Rome paid him off to leave. Not with honor, not with diplomacy, with gold. A lot of gold. Enough to make the Senate wince. Alaric accepted, but he also noticed something. The empire was weaker than it looked. Cracked, divided, uncertain, like a marble statue that seemed sturdy but made a suspicious sound whenever someone knocked on it. The Second Siege, 409 CE. Alaric returned, not as an enemy, but as a man insisting Rome honor the agreement he believed they had. He asked for land in northern Italy for his people, a reasonable request. Rome refused again. Conflicting political factions in the city bickered. Some wanted peace, some wanted war, some were too busy trying to maintain their personal power to consider anything else. So Alaric camped outside the walls once more. Again, he didn't attack. He proposed a settlement. He offered military service. He proposed becoming a formal ally of the empire. Rome wavered, stalled, then insulted him through a messenger who clearly did not understand basic diplomacy or basic self-preservation. Patience, which had been holding on by a thread, finally snapped. Not entirely, not violently, but enough for Alaric to realize something essential. Rome would never treat the Goths fairly unless it was forced to. He tightened the siege. Hunger returned. The Senate panicked again. More gold changed hands, more promises were made. And again, Alaric withdrew, frustrated but still trying to avoid a full confrontation. The Third Siege, 410 CE. The final siege did not begin as an act of vengeance. It began as the last attempt at negotiation. Alaric met with Roman representatives outside the city. He offered terms. He offered loyalty. He offered compromise after compromise. He simply asked that Rome live up to its word. The Romans almost agreed, almost. But political infighting inside the city sabotaged the negotiations at the last moment. Angry factions overturned decisions, expelled Alaric's allies, and effectively slammed the door in his face. History sometimes turns on big moments, but more often it turns on small, stubborn acts of pride. This was one of them. Alaric walked back to his camp. The night was calm. His people waited silently, trusting him to decide what came next. And after years of betrayal, starvation, broken treaties, and 2 pointless sieges, he finally accepted the truth. Rome had left him no choice. When dawn came, the gates of Rome were opened. Some say it was an inside job. Some say it was fear. Some say it was starvation. No one knows for certain. But when the Visigoths entered the city, they did not burn it to the ground. They did not slaughter indiscriminately. They did not act like destroyers. They acted like people who had been pushed too far for too long. They took food, they took gold, they took valuables, they freed slaves, they punished officials who had mistreated them. They walked through the streets of the eternal city not like conquerors, but like men retrieving what had been denied them for decades. For Rome, the shock was immense. The city had not been captured in nearly 800 years. It had stood against Carthage, against rebellions, against invasions, against storms of history, and now it had fallen to a people Rome once refused to take seriously. For the Goths, it was not triumph. It was survival, justice, a necessary act after years of mistreatment. And for Alaric, it was closure. He did not stay long. He did not claim Rome. He did not declare a new kingdom. He took what his people needed and moved on, leading them south toward new possibilities. His goal had never been to destroy the empire. It had been to secure a future for the ones who trusted him. But history would remember him as the man who cracked the uncrackable, opened the unopenable, and made the eternal city feel surprisingly mortal. As night finally settles over the quiet ruins of that memory, the wind moves gently between broken stones and narrow streets, whispering the soft truth that every great power eventually meets someone who simply will not accept unfair treatment anymore. And in that quiet, Rome learned what the Goths had always known. Even the strongest walls can fall. When pushed by enough hunger, enough frustration, and enough broken promises, the night remains still. The city sleeps. But the echo of Alaric's footsteps lingers, a reminder that sometimes history changes not with a roar, but with the slow, steady determination of a people who refuse to be ignored any longer. The night settles softly over the forests of Central Europe, the kind of deep, velvety darkness that makes every pine tree look a little taller and every distant hill sound a little quieter. Somewhere in this calm, a group of people are preparing for a journey so long, so improbable, and so accidentally history-changing that if you told them what lay ahead, they would probably ask you to repeat it more slowly. These are the Vandals, one of those wandering tribes that Rome liked to group under a single dramatic label, even though they were simply people doing their best to survive in a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. They were farmers, herders, riders, families, elders, children, and warriors. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to bring down the Western Roman Empire. They woke up because it was cold, food was scarce, the political climate was unstable, the Huns were pushing from behind, and absolutely no one wanted to deal with all that while sitting still. so they moved. Their journey began in the dense forests of Central Europe, where winters could make even the bravest traveler reconsider all life decisions. The Vandals packed their wagons, gathered their herds, wrapped themselves in furs, and started walking. Not marching, just walking. Step by step, distance by distance. They weren't in a hurry, but they weren't taking scenic detours either. When you're migrating as an entire community, your pace is somewhere between determined and please don't let the children wander again. They trekked across forested valleys, through rivers that insisted on being colder than necessary, and down mountain paths that made every wagon creak like an old chair. And as they moved, they picked up allies. The Allans, a group of skilled horsemen with a talent for surviving chaos, joined them. It wasn't a grand alliance formed through ceremonial oaths. It was more like, you're moving, we're moving. Let's survive together. Perfect. By the time the Vandals reached the Rhine River around the year 406, the world behind them was shifting fast. The Huns were pressing westward. Other tribes were migrating too. The Roman frontier was stretched thinner than a badly baked loaf of bread, and winter was settling hard on northern Gaul. So, on a particularly cold December night, one of those nights when the wind feels personally offended by your existence, the Vandals, the Alans, and several other groups crossed the frozen Rhine. Not because they planned an invasion with dramatic banners and speeches, but because the river was literally solid enough to walk on, and they were running out of safe places to go. This crossing shocked the Roman world. The Rhine had always been a natural barrier, a line Rome believed nature had drawn specifically for its convenience. And yet, here was an entire migrating nation, breezing across it with the calm determination of people who simply didn't have time to be impressed by Roman geography. Once in Gaul, things became complicated. The Vandals needed food, the Romans needed stability, the local towns needed less chaos, and winter, as usual, needed to mind its own business. But nothing listened to anyone. Clashes broke out, negotiations failed, territories were contested, and the Vandals kept moving like a river cutting through rock, slowly but relentlessly. From Gaul, they drifted into Hispania, the land Rome called Spain. There they settled briefly in regions like Baetica and Gallaecia, trying to make a life, plant crops, and pretend for a moment that the world wasn't spinning wildly out of control. But peace for the Vandals never stayed long. Roman generals tried to push them out. Rival tribes created tension. Stability slipped through their fingers like sand. And then came the invitation. It might have been one of history's strangest open doors. Bonifacius, a Roman governor in North Africa, embroiled in political trouble and desperate for allies, allegedly invited the Vandals to cross into Africa to support him. Whether he truly intended this, or it was a miscommunication of spectacular proportions, the Vandals took the opportunity as a sign. If you're a migrating tribe and someone points you toward fertile land with warm weather and fewer marauding horsemen, you don't waste time overthinking the details. So in 429, the Vandals crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. Picture the scene. An entire community, families, warriors, carts, livestock, boarding whatever ships they could obtain, eyes fixed on the horizon of a new continent. It wasn't an invasion fleet in the dramatic sense. It was a floating migration with the determination of people who had walked thousands of miles and decided that sailing a bit more couldn't possibly be harder than all the terrain they had conquered on foot. And when they reached North Africa, something unexpected happened. They thrived. The land was good, Fertile plains, olive groves, wheat fields, and sunshine that seemed determined to make up for every winter they had ever endured in Central Europe. The Vandals, armed with determination and perhaps a new appreciation for warmer weather, carved out territory, strengthened their presence, and began shaping a kingdom. Rome, meanwhile, did what Rome often did. It underestimated the situation. North Africa wasn't just a province, it was the empire's granary, its breadbasket, its agricultural heart, the region that fed entire cities, armies, and bureaucracies. Without African grain, Rome struggled to supply itself. Without Carthage, the empire's economic stability cracked, and the Vandals captured Carthage. Not through overwhelming force or some dramatic cinematic assault, but through strategic timing, negotiation, persistence, and Rome's profound inability to manage internal chaos. In 439, Carthage fell, quietly, surprisingly, and decisively. It was a moment that made Roman officials sit upright, choke on their wine, and realize something serious had just happened. From Carthage, the Vandals built a kingdom, not a temporary encampment, not a wandering settlement, but a structured, functioning state. They repaired infrastructure, organized administration, developed a fleet, and began controlling Mediterranean trade routes. They even developed a navy that Rome found extremely inconvenient, especially when it arrived uninvited at Italian coastlines and politely reminded the empire who now owned the sea lanes. The Vandals weren't mindless destroyers. They were survivors with remarkable adaptability. They cultivated land, minted coins, negotiated treaties, and ran a government with surprising efficiency. Their presence reshaped the entire balance of the Western Mediterranean. And yet, history has not always been kind to them. Their name, Vandal, became synonymous with destruction, mostly because later chroniclers assumed anyone who took something from Rome must be acting out of spite. But the Vandals were not Vandals. They were people forced into movement, shaped by hardship, pushed by displacement, and driven by the basic need to find a place where winter didn't try to defeat them every year. If anything, they were the ultimate long-distance travelers. They crossed forests, mountains, rivers, plains, kingdoms, and finally, an entire sea. They traveled thousands of miles over decades. They raised children on the move. They fought not for conquest, but for existence. And when they finally built a home in North Africa, they held onto it with the calm pride of people who had walked far enough to deserve a bit of stability. Rome, however, felt the loss deeply. Losing North Africa meant losing food supplies. Losing Carthage meant losing economic control. Losing the trade networks meant losing wealth, and losing wealth meant losing the ability to pay armies, repair roads, maintain defenses, and keep an increasingly stressed empire from collapsing. The Vandal kingdom didn't destroy Rome, but it removed a supporting pillar so crucial that the entire structure began to tilt dangerously. And somewhere in that long chain of cause and effect, the quiet truth settles over history like the soft night air. Sometimes an empire doesn't fall because it is struck down by an unstoppable enemy. Sometimes it falls because its strength is spread too thin, its decisions too inconsistent, and its ability to adapt too slow compared to people who learned to survive by moving forward no matter what. As the night deepens over Carthage and the cool breeze drifts across ancient rooftops, you can almost imagine the soft, steady rhythm of a people who finally stopped walking. Fires glow gently in courtyards, ships rest in the harbor, Families sleep under the African sky. After decades of wandering, the Vandals have found a home. And an empire far to the north is beginning to understand what that really means. The night spreads across the eastern plains with a slow, steady sweep, like a blanket pulled gently over a restless world. Out here, the wind moves in long, unbroken lines, brushing past tall grasses and distant horizons, carrying faint echoes of hoofbeats from riders who travel faster than most people can think. In this vast quiet, the Huns were already becoming a force, a presence, a momentum, long before anyone in Rome realized what was happening. And at the center of that momentum stood Attila, not the fire-breathing monster later storytellers tried to describe, nor the exaggerated villain from the panicked imaginations of Roman chroniclers, but a leader forged by the endless movement of his people. He understood the plains, the pace of migration, the rhythms of survival, and the strange mathematics of steppe warfare, where speed counts more than walls and adaptability counts more than regulations. He wasn't trying to terrify Rome. Terror just happened organically as a side effect. The making of a leader. Before Attila's rise, the Huns were already well known on the steppes. They moved in fluid groups, shaped by landscape rather than borders, their lives woven from travel, grazing patterns, and the kind of riding skills that made even skilled Roman cavalry look like they were still learning the basics. A Hun child learned to ride a horse about as early as a Roman child learned to walk. By the time most Roman officers were figuring out how to read administrative forms, Hun riders were able to shoot arrows backward while galloping at full speed, an ability that made Roman soldiers look up from their carefully arranged battle lines and say something polite like, "Well, that's not ideal." Leadership in this world was earned, not inherited by default. Attila grew into his role surrounded by constant movement, shifting alliances and skies so open that even the clouds looked like they had too much freedom. He learned to command through presence, strategy, and a calm understanding of human motivations. When he eventually united the Hunnic factions with his brother Bleda, it wasn't through intimidation alone. It was through the kind of firm, quiet authority that makes people follow, not because they're afraid, but because they trust the direction. When Bleda died under circumstances historians still tilt their heads at suspiciously, Attila became the sole ruler. Whatever opinions people held about the transition, the outcome was clear. The Huns were now united under a single leader with ambition, focus, and exceptional mobility. The world begins to shift. Once Attila consolidated Hunnic power, the landscape of Europe began rearranging itself with alarming speed. The Huns did not stay still. They moved in great, sweeping arcs across the plains, crossing borders as though borders were merely polite suggestions. And the tribes living between the Huns and Rome felt the pressure immediately. The Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Heruli, the Rugians. Everyone felt the weight of Hunnic expansion. Many submitted, not because they lacked courage, but because resisting a cavalry force that seemed able to appear and disappear like moving shadows was simply impractical. With every tribe added to their influence, the Huns grew stronger, faster, more coordinated. Their presence pushed waves of displaced peoples outward like ripples from a stone tossed into a lake. Rome, meanwhile, watched from afar with the increasingly uncomfortable awareness that something large, fast, and very determined was heading in its general direction. But Rome was exhausted. The Western Empire struggled with internal politics, fading resources, questionable decisions, and the occasional general who tried very hard, but perhaps should have chosen a different career path. The Eastern Empire had more strength, but not enough unity to face this new threat alone. And in this fatigue, Rome did what Rome sometimes did. It outsourced its problems. Germanic against Germanic. To counter the pressure of the Huns, Rome leaned heavily on its Germanic foederati, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and other groups who had already become deeply woven into the empire's military fabric. It was a peculiar arrangement, like asking someone who recently argued with you to help protect your house from a very fast, very persistent bear. Everyone involved understood the risk, but they all agreed the bear was a more immediate problem. Rome's dependence on Gothic and Frankish troops increased every year. These were skilled fighters, loyal to their own leaders, not to the empire itself. And while Rome tried to pretend this was a sustainable strategy, anyone paying attention could see the foundation wobbling like a wagon with uneven wheels. Meanwhile, Attila observed all of this with interest. He wasn't in a hurry. He allowed Rome to twist itself into knots, trying to manage alliances. He negotiated when it benefited him. He applied pressure when it suited him. He demanded tribute and received it. He watched Rome's confidence erode gradually, slowly enough to keep things interesting, quickly enough to open opportunities. Attila enters the West. Attila moved toward the Western Empire only when he was ready, not because he was compelled, and when he finally did, he did so with the calm assurance of someone who had already calculated 12 steps ahead. His riders moved through Gaul, a sweeping motion of hoofbeats and dust, pushing entire communities out of his way without needing to engage them directly. The stories of his speed grew faster than his armies could march. Some Romans imagined he had thousands of warriors. Others believed he had tens of thousands. Most simply agreed that they didn't have enough soldiers left to feel comfortable about it. Rome couldn't face Attila alone. It simply didn't have the numbers. And so, in an ironic twist of history, the empire that had once prided itself on dominating barbarians now relied completely on barbarians to save itself. It was like asking your neighbor, who borrowed your tools and never returned them, to help fix your roof before it collapsed. Everyone involved knew it wasn't the ideal situation, but there were no better options. An unlikely alliance. The Western Roman general Aetius, one of the last competent military leaders Rome would ever produce, understood exactly how dire the situation was. Aetius had spent part of his youth among the Huns, understood their strategies, and knew their strengths intimately. He also knew the only way to face the Huns was to unite everyone else. So he gathered the Visigoths, then the Franks, then the Burgundians, then the Alans. Even smaller tribes joined, each bringing a patchwork of loyalty, weapons, and personal grievances. It was less one united army and more a group project held together by mild panic. But it worked. Barely. The dependence that broke Rome. The deeper truth beneath all this movement, negotiation, and hurried alliance building was simple. Rome no longer controlled its own military destiny. The empire had grown too reliant on federated troops, too reliant on leaders who did not answer to Rome, too reliant on alliances that required constant maintenance and diplomatic juggling. Attila didn't break Rome's military. He exposed the cracks that were already there. Every time Rome leaned on its Germanic allies, it lost a little more authority. Every time a non-Roman commander gained prestige, the empire lost influence. Every time the empire begged, bargained, or paid off someone, it chipped away at its own legitimacy. By the time Attila reached his peak of power, Rome was held together more by negotiations than by strength, more by hope than by strategy, more by habit than by stability. The final whisper of approaching collapse. As the night deepens over the plains where the Huns once rode, you can almost sense the shift in the air. The wind glides low, carrying a memory of riders who moved faster than empires could react, who changed the rhythm of Europe without planting a single city or carving a single monument. Attila's arrival did not cause Rome's collapse. It accelerated it, clarified it, tugged at every loose thread until the tapestry began unraveling with quiet inevitability. Rome tried to hold on through diplomacy, alliances, hurried defenses, and desperate negotiations. But the momentum of the Huns, the instability of the borders, and the empire's growing dependence on outsiders combined in a way no Roman strategist had ever been trained to handle. And so, under the gentle cover of night, the empire moved one step closer to the edge, a step taken not with a shout but with the soft, relentless rhythm of hooves crossing a continent. Rome, exhausted and stretched thin, could not keep pace. And in this quiet imbalance, you can feel the story turning, gently but decisively, toward a world that would soon look very different. The night settles gently over the wide plains of northeastern Gaul, stretching across fields that once echoed with the thunder of hooves and the clatter of armor. Today they are quiet, just soft wind brushing through tall grass, moving slowly, as if even the earth remembers how exhausting that day had been, because once, on this calm ground, Rome gathered the last of its strength for a stand that felt less like a heroic charge and more like a weary, okay, one more time, let's try not to fall apart. This was the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, an event both grand and strangely fragile, where Rome and the Visigoths, who had once fought each other bitterly, teamed up to stop Attila's momentum. It was not the kind of partnership that forms naturally. It was the kind formed by mutual exhaustion and the shared realization that if they didn't cooperate, they'd both be trampled by Hunnic horses before lunchtime. General Aetius, the Roman commander, understood better than anyone that Rome could not win this battle alone. The Western Empire was a shadow of itself, overstretched, underfunded, and packed with political drama that would make any modern office meeting look calm by comparison. The Visigoths, however, still had energy, warriors, and a king, Theodoric, who believed in keeping Attila from turning Gaul into a personal playground. So, an alliance was formed, awkward, tense, practical, the kind of alliance where both sides tried to look confident while quietly hoping the other wouldn't suddenly change their mind. When Attila's forces approached, it wasn't subtle. The ground seemed to vibrate under the pressure of thousands of riders. Dust clouded the horizon. To Roman soldiers standing in formation, it must have felt like watching a wave swell higher and higher before breaking. Attila's reputation traveled faster than his cavalry. Everyone knew the Huns fought with speed and unpredictability. They were like a storm, a fast-moving one that didn't wait for anyone to finish tying their sandals. But Rome and the Visigoths had something the Huns didn't expect: stubbornness. Deep, weary, heavily armed stubbornness. As the sun dipped low and the battle began, the plains erupted into chaos. Formations clashed. Arrows streaked across the field like dark streaks cutting through the sky. Horses reared, shields locked. Every warrior, no matter which side they fought for, must have felt the ground trembling beneath them, as if the earth itself was watching and wondering how long they could keep this up. Aetius focused on coordinating the alliance. No small task, considering the Visigoths had their own battle rhythm and the Romans were trying to remember how to fight at full capacity again. Meanwhile, Theodoric led his warriors with fierce determination. For him, this wasn't about helping Rome. This was about survival, protecting his people, making sure Attila didn't roll over Gaul the way storms roll over plains. Somewhere amid the noise, the dust, and the confusion, the battle began to tilt. The Visigoths managed to push back part of the Hunnic line. The Romans held their ground, barely but impressively, given how tired they were as an empire. Attila's cavalry slammed again and again into the allied ranks, trying to break them with sheer force, but the line held. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, fell in battle. How exactly he died remains uncertain. Some say he was thrown from his horse, others that he was struck amid the chaos. But his death sent ripples across the field. His warriors roared with grief and fury, pushing harder, fighting with the desperate intensity of people who had just lost someone irreplaceable. Attila realized the momentum was slipping away. He had expected the alliance to crack under pressure, to fall apart the way Rome often did internally. But it didn't. The Romans stayed firm. The Visigoths, fueled by grief, fought even harder. The Huns, for the first time in a long while, felt the ground shift beneath them, not metaphorically, but literally, as they retreated toward their fortified wagon circle, a defensive ring that served as their emergency shelter. Attila braced for a counterattack, expecting Aetius to storm the wagons and finish the job. But that attack never came. Aetius, ever the strategist, saw further than the battlefield. Destroying Attila completely might strengthen the Visigoths too much. The Western Empire was fragile. Balancing powers mattered more than dramatic victories. So he allowed Attila to withdraw, much to the confusion of soldiers who were ready for one more push. The battle ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Both sides suffered heavy losses. The plains were scarred. The air was thick with dust and silence. It wasn't a glorious victory. It was survival, a brief, hard-won breath for an empire running out of them. And yet, history remembers the Catalonian plains as a Roman victory, perhaps because it slowed Attila long enough to give the Western Empire a little more time. Not much, but enough to matter. Enough to prove that Rome could still stand its ground when it absolutely had to, even if standing required all remaining energy, a lot of help from the Visigoths, and a general who knew how to play political chess while in the middle of a battlefield. As the night settles over the field now, long after the last arrow fell and the last shout faded, the plains are quiet again. The wind drifts gently, carrying no fear, no thunder of hooves, only the soft hum of nature reclaiming what war once disturbed. It's peaceful, almost deceptively peaceful, considering this was one of the final moments when Rome managed to say, with quiet determination, "Not yet." Not triumph, not resurgence, just a pause in the collapse, a moment of resistance, a flicker of strength in an empire whose flame was almost gone. The Catalonian plains didn't save Rome, but they let it breathe just a little longer. And sometimes history turns on breaths that small. The night settles over the fading Western Roman Empire with a softness that almost feels like sympathy. It drapes itself across crumbling walls, half-empty barracks, silent training fields, and administrative buildings where clerks are still trying, very bravely, to pretend they have everything under control. But everyone knows the truth now. The empire is running out of soldiers, running out of money, running out of the kind of strength it once carried so effortlessly. If Rome in the 1st century had been a well-oiled war machine, humming confidently along the edges of the world, Rome in the 5th century was more like a once mighty cart held together with rope, spare planks, and hope. Hope was doing most of the work. Archaeological evidence, especially the research highlighted by scholars like Ward Perkins, paints a picture that is subtle but unmistakable. The empire didn't crumble because of one sudden blow. It thinned out, hollowed, wore down in the quiet places long before anyone noticed, like fabric fading at the elbows or a stone losing its sharp edges after years of wind. The Roman army, once the envy of the known world, had become a patchwork force. Gone were the days when legions could be summoned with a snap of imperial authority. Men in uniform, polished shields, standardized equipment, marching in unison like a single organism. Those legions still existed in name, but in reality they were shadows of what they once had been. Recruitment had always been a challenge, but by this point it felt like Rome was trying to refill a barrel with a dozen cracks. Wealthy landowners preferred hiring private guards rather than sending their sons to the frontiers. Provincial leaders stretched the truth about troop numbers. Entire regions under pressure simply could not spare the manpower, and many communities, worn thin by taxation and conflict, quietly hoped someone else would volunteer first. As Roman citizens stepped back, another group stepped in. The foederati, non-Roman soldiers, serving under their own chieftains, following their own loyalties, fighting not for an empire they admired, but for the land and privileges they had been promised. At first, having foederati seemed convenient. Rome got soldiers. The tribes got territory and status. But convenience has an expiration date, and this one arrived faster than expected. The empire found itself relying more and more on these federated troops, until eventually the balance shifted in a way Rome never intended. The army wasn't Roman with foreign support. It was foreign with Roman paperwork. And paperwork, historically speaking, has never held a frontier. The core Roman units, once the backbone of imperial defense, had shrunk to a fraction of their former size. Equipment was outdated. Some garrisons were staffed by men who hadn't been paid in months, if not years. Others simply disbanded themselves, deciding that guarding a border no one respected anymore was not worth missing harvest season. Meanwhile, money was becoming a rumor. Taxes from North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket and piggy bank, no longer arrived after the Vandals claimed Carthage. Without African grain and African revenue, the Western Empire lost its economic engine. Paying soldiers became a struggle. Equipping them became a debate. Replacing fallen troops became a kind of wishful thinking. It is hard to run an empire on wishful thinking. Imagine a quiet evening in a Roman administrative office. A scribe hunches over a cracked wooden desk, recalculating the military budget for the 10th time. He scratches out a number, writes another, sighs deeply, and wonders if anyone has noticed the entire left column now says, insufficient funds. But he keeps trying because Rome's greatness once came from people who believed in pushing forward even when the numbers disagreed. Unfortunately, numbers are stubborn. Rome's defenses began to thin like hairlines in stressful seasons. Frontier walls were patched instead of rebuilt. roads meant for rapid troop movement deteriorated. Fortresses became undermanned. Places that once hosted thousands of soldiers now housed dozens. If an enemy showed up, the response time was measured not in hours, but in whenever someone finds a horse that still runs. And the foederati, who were supposed to fill the gaps, were powerful, skilled, and mobile, but not predictable. They followed their own leaders. They negotiated constantly. They fought bravely when compensated, and less enthusiastically when Rome forgot to keep its promises, which Rome did quite often because promises require resources, and resources were now more mythical than the creatures painted on tavern walls. There were moments, fleeting, hopeful moments, when Roman commanders like Aetius managed to hold everything together through a mix of diplomacy, personal charisma, and the kind of crisis management skills normally seen in people trying to stop a dam from bursting using only their hands. But even the best commanders could not reverse the erosion happening beneath their feet. Without enough Roman soldiers, the empire lost control of its own army. Without enough money, it lost control of its institutions. Without control of its institutions, it lost control of its destiny. And yet, if you stood on a Roman hilltop at sunset in those final decades, you wouldn't see an empire collapsing in dramatic flames. You'd see a landscape of quiet farms, sleepy towns, scattered garrisons, and distant smoke curling from hearth fires. Life went on. The collapse was not loud, it was gentle, slow, a dimming of light rather than an explosion. Rome did not fall because its enemies were too strong. Rome fell because its own legs grew too tired to hold its weight. When the Foederati finally became the primary military force in the West, when Roman legions existed mostly as memories, there was no clear moment when the empire said, "We can no longer defend ourselves." Instead, the truth arrived gradually, like a late-night realization you've been avoiding. The tools for survival were now mostly outside Roman hands. The night deepens over the empty training grounds. The barracks are quiet. A lone shield leans against a wall, dented, unclaimed. Somewhere far away, foreign troops gather around their own campfires, troops technically serving Rome, but bound to leaders Rome cannot command. The empire that once felt eternal is now relying on borrowed strength, borrowed loyalty, and borrowed time. This is the point in the story where the fall becomes inevitable, not because of one invasion or one battle or one surprising disaster, but because the empire no longer has the inner force to steady itself. And in the soft darkness, you can almost hear the faint whisper. An empire without soldiers is an empire without breath. And Rome, breathing shallowly, is nearing the quiet end of its long, unforgettable night. The night settles softly over the Italian peninsula, drifting across rooftops, empty forums, and old marble statues that have seen far too much history and would really appreciate a quiet retirement. In the gentle darkness, Ravenna, the Western Empire's final capital, rests in a stillness that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. Because this is the night when something enormous ends, but does so with such soft footsteps that many people don't notice until morning. This is the night of 476 CE, the night when Odoacer, a man not born Roman but raised in Rome's long shadow, walked calmly into the heart of an empire that had been crumbling for decades and did something remarkably simple. He ended it, not with fire, not with a dramatic speech, not with an earth-shaking battle, but with a gesture so tidy and so strangely polite that history sometimes forgets how quietly the Western Roman Empire slipped into the dark. A boy emperor with a big name and a small future. Romulus Augustulus was the last Western Roman emperor. His name was impressive, the kind of name Roman historians would have adored centuries earlier. Romulus, like the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, as if someone held the name up to the light and said, this one is cute. Let's make it smaller. But names can't hold empires together, and Romulus was more symbol than ruler. A teenager placed on the throne not because he was destined for greatness, but because his father, Orestes, needed a figurehead. Rome had long reached the stage where emperors were chosen less by destiny and more by whoever had the biggest military contract that week. Romulus didn't rule armies, he didn't command legions, he didn't decide policy. He probably didn't even choose what he had for breakfast without someone checking the budget first. He was the final note of a symphony already fading into silence. Enter Odoacer, calm, practical, and slightly tired of everything. Odoacer led a group of foederati, soldiers of foreign origin who fought for Rome, but had grown deeply frustrated with unpaid wages, broken promises, and the empire's consistent attempts to look stable while wobbling like a three-legged table. He was not a barbarian caricature. He was not a destroyer of worlds. He was a professional, a commander, a man who understood that Rome wasn't an empire anymore. It was a shell pretending to be one. When the Foederati demanded land in Italy as payment for years of service, Orestes refused. Maybe he believed Rome still had some authority left to enforce decisions. Maybe he was simply out of options. But that refusal set everything in motion. Odoacer marched, not to burn cities or topple civilization, but to fix a problem Rome was no longer capable of fixing. Orestes fled, then was captured. Resistance crumbled, not with drama, but with resignation. And Romulus, the teenage emperor, was left sitting in a palace, wondering what kind of conversation this was going to be. The softest coup in imperial history. Imagine the meeting. Romulus Augustulus, barely old enough to grow a proper imperial beard, staring at Odoacer, a tall, composed military leader who felt more like a weary school administrator about to gently end a failing school year. There was no shouting, no dramatic overthrow, just a quiet acknowledgement of what both men already knew. The Western Roman Empire was already gone. Odoacer spared Romulus, a kindness rare in imperial politics. He didn't imprison him, he didn't execute him, he didn't exile him to some lonely island. Instead, he sent the boy to live comfortably with relatives in Campania, a retirement plan before life had even properly started. If history had a Best Exit Package award, Romulus would win it. Then Odoacer picked up the imperial regalia, the crown, and the purple cloak, and made a decision that felt almost ceremonial in its gentleness. He sent them to Constantinople, back to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, as if to say, we don't need two emperors anymore. One Rome is enough. The West is finished. Let's avoid unnecessary paperwork. A world that didn't realize what had happened What's astonishing is how quietly it all unfolded. No city burned, no massive riot erupted, no great catastrophe marked the moment. Most citizens probably went to bed unaware that the empire they lived under no longer existed. And when they woke up, life continued. Bread was baked, markets opened, chickens wandered precisely where chickens always wander. The world did not tilt off its axis. The end of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a crash, it was a sigh. Rome had been declining for generations, losing land, losing money, losing soldiers, losing authority. Odoacer didn't topple it. He simply removed the last decorative pillar, holding up a structure no longer capable of standing. And perhaps that's why the moment feels so strangely gentle. Odoacer declared himself Rex Italiae, king of Italy, but ruled in cooperation with the Eastern Empire. He kept Roman institutions running, preserved Roman laws, and maintained order with surprising stability. Italy, for a brief window of time, entered a period that felt almost like a deep exhale after centuries of tension. The symbolic weight of a crown set down. Historians often mark 476 as the fall of Rome, but the experience on the ground was not the dramatic collapse people imagine. It was the moment when the world quietly acknowledged something that had been true for a long time. No more Western emperors. No more pretending the old system could be restored. No more illusions of endless Roman authority. Just a calm acceptance that the world had changed. In the soft evening air, you can almost picture Odoacer standing alone after sending the imperial symbols eastward, the twilight fading over Ravenna, the quiet rustle of cypress trees, the weight of centuries lifting ever so slightly as the old order gives way to the new. No fireworks, no trumpets, just the end of a long, tired story. The night that Rome finally rested. As darkness deepens across the peninsula, the Western Roman Empire exists now only in memory, an echo of marble halls, dusty legions, triumphal arches, and long roads stretching across continents. It does not collapse with violence. It simply stops. The soldiers who once guarded its borders are gone. The coffers that once fueled its armies are empty. The emperors who once guided its fate are names on crumbling inscriptions. And in this quiet, Odoacer's calm, almost respectful act becomes the last page of a story that began nearly 1,000 years earlier. He didn't destroy Rome. He closed it gently. The night holds that moment with extraordinary softness, like the world acknowledging the passing of something ancient and tired and magnificent. And somewhere in the stillness, the empire that once conquered vast lands finally rests, wrapped not in glory, but in the quiet dignity of an ending long overdue. The night settles softly over the former lands of the Western Roman Empire, drifting through ruined forums, abandoned barracks, and quiet villages that no longer belong to Rome but are not yet anything else. The collapse is over. The dust has settled. Odoacer has politely wrapped up the last imperial paperwork, and across these vast landscapes, the tribes once labeled as barbarians stand in the silence, blinking at a world that suddenly feels very, very open. This is the part of history few people talk about calmly. What did the nomadic tribes actually do after Rome was gone? They didn't throw celebrations. They didn't burn everything. They didn't sit on thrones, twirling imaginary villain mustaches. They took a deep breath, looked around at the land they now controlled, and realized something important. Oh no, we have to run this now. And with that sobering thought, the next chapter of Europe quietly began. The Ostrogoths, a kingdom of patchwork continuity. When the dust settled, the Ostrogoths, led by the surprisingly organized and politically patient Theodoric, stepped into Italy like someone inheriting a very old, very complicated house. Not crumbling enough to abandon, but definitely eccentric in its layout. Theodoric didn't try to erase Rome, he admired it. He liked its laws, its structure, its sense of order, what remained of it. So instead of replacing them, he kept them. The Senate still met, Roman administrators still managed taxes, aqueducts, and roads. The courts functioned, the grain arrived, life continued, quietly, with a new signature at the bottom of documents. You can almost imagine Theodoric standing in the half-dark palace in Ravenna, brushing dust off a marble statue and muttering, "All right, let's keep most of this. Just fix the parts that squeak." The Ostrogothic kingdom was less a conquest and more a renovation project, undertaken by people who appreciated the architecture but wanted to update the lighting. Under their rule, Italy experienced a strange but gentle stability. Roman culture lived on. Craftsmen still crafted. Farmers still farmed. Bureaucrats continued their eternal battle with paperwork. The world didn't collapse into chaos. It simply shifted. Quietly, seamlessly, into something new. The Visigoths, settlers of the West who kept moving east and west simultaneously. Meanwhile, the Visigoths, those same Goths who had once walked across the Balkans, bargained with emperors, and politely pillaged Rome in 410, settled down in Gaul and eventually Hispania. Their journey didn't end with Rome's fall. They continued shaping their kingdom like travelers, slowly unpacking after decades of migration. They built towns, they wrote laws, they organized councils, they took Roman administrative systems and blended them with their own traditions. It was less an imperial takeover and more of a co-living arrangement with history. Picture a Visigothic leader sitting at his desk at dusk, copying parts of Roman law codes, pausing occasionally to say, "These clauses are good. Let's keep those. But maybe delete the parts about paying taxes twice." Visigothic rule became a cornerstone of southwestern Europe. They preserved more Roman structure than Rome itself had managed to keep in its final decades. The cities of Hispania thrived under them, Toledo, Merida, Barcelona, all carrying echoes of Rome wrapped in new Gothic rhythms. They didn't destroy civilization. They repotted it into a new soil. The Vandals. From nomads to naval powers. The Vandals, those long wandering travelers who crossed mountains, rivers, and eventually the Mediterranean, kept building their North African kingdom. Carthage, once Rome's feared rival, became Vandal headquarters, bustling with trade, agriculture, and a navy that allowed them to control much of the sea. It's somewhat humorous, really. Rome, the empire built on maritime dominance, now found its supply routes politely monitored by people it once dismissed. The Vandals didn't just survive, they prospered. Their administration flourished, ports thrived, and Africa became one of the most stable and prosperous regions of the post-Roman world. Picture a Vandal sailor leaning on the rail of his ship at sunset, the warm breeze brushing past, saying, this isn't a bad retirement from the whole wandering across Eurasia lifestyle. Their kingdom endured for nearly a century, not a flash of destruction, but a functioning state that blended old Roman systems with new Vandal identity. The Franks, quietly building. Europe while everyone was distracted. And then there were the Franks, arguably the most patient, low-key, quietly strategic of all the groups. While others moved dramatically across the map, the Franks expanded steadily through Gaul, picking up land the way someone tidies a room one corner at a time. They didn't blaze into history, they seeped into it. Under Clovis, they unified. Under successors, they absorbed regions. And gradually, almost gently, they built the foundations of what would become medieval Europe, and later modern France and Germany. Frankish leaders adopted Roman customs, Roman titles, Roman administrative habits, practically everything Roman except the part where Rome collapsed. They kept Roman roads maintained, Roman towns alive, and Roman boundaries partially functional, all while adding their own flavor, their own culture, their own political rhythm. Imagine a Frankish nobleman sitting outside a wooden hall at twilight, poking a map of Gaul with a stick and murmuring, "Well, since no one's using this land anymore, we might as well." Their quiet growth mattered more than any single raid or battle. It shaped Europe. They didn't destroy Rome, they replaced what Rome stopped being. By the time 476 arrived, Rome wasn't Rome anymore. It was a tired, stretched, economically hollowed-out version of itself. The nomadic tribes didn't topple a mighty empire. They stepped into the empty spaces Rome could no longer fill. They became administrators, kings, judges, farmers, traders, diplomats, and builders. They adopted Roman tools, Roman languages, Roman laws, blending them with their own until a new identity formed. This is what they did after Rome fell. They took responsibility for lands Rome couldn't hold. They revived towns Rome had abandoned. They preserved institutions Rome had let decay. They governed where Rome had stopped governing. They created new kingdoms that would become the roots of Europe. They didn't erase the Roman world. They continued it. Reshaped, reimagined, quieter, but still alive. The night after empires end. As the night deepens over these new kingdoms, the world feels neither destroyed nor reborn. It feels in transition, the flicker of torchlight in a Frankish village, the quiet scratch of a scribe in Toledo, the soft creaking of a Vandal ship rocking at anchor, the gentle breath of wind through Italian cypress trees under Ostrogothic rule. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just the slow, steady forming of medieval Europe. The nomadic tribes didn't vanish into history. They became history, the architects of what came next. In the calm of the night, with the empire finally asleep, they began the work of building something new. The night settles gently over the old Roman world, drifting through broken walls, worn-out roads, and silent forums where voices once echoed with authority. If you walk through these ruins in the soft darkness, you can almost feel the air humming with a quiet truth. Something simple, something unglamorous, something historians spent centuries trying to say politely. Rome wasn't destroyed. Rome ran out of energy. The nomadic tribes were the final push, yes, but the empire was already leaning heavily on one crumbling pillar after another. In the dim glow of the night, this becomes easier to see. The empire had been tired for a very long time. Before the Vandals sailed, before the Goths marched, before Attila even learned to ride a horse, Rome had begun a slow inward collapse, less like a dramatic explosion, more like an old house settling unevenly until one day the floor simply gives out. Edward Gibbon, Peter Heather, Adrian Goldsworthy, Brian Ward Perkins, scholars who spent their lives poking through the rubble, agree on one unromantic point. Rome weakened itself long before anyone arrived to push it over. Think of an empire that, for centuries, burned fuel like a bonfire, and then gradually the logs got smaller, the flames lower, the sparks fewer, not because someone doused it, but because the fireplace was simply running out of wood. At some point, Rome didn't collapse. It exhaled. Internal fraying. The threads start to loosen. Picture a tunic that's been worn too long. At first, a thread pulls, hardly noticeable, then another, then a seam loosens. Eventually, the fabric starts drifting apart from the inside, long before it ever tears fully. Rome's internal problems looked exactly like that. Civil wars spread like a seasonal illness. A new emperor here, another one a year later, assassinations sprinkled in between like punctuation marks. Generals fought each other more often than they fought enemies. Loyalty shifted like desert sand. The empire became a place where the job of emperor was exciting only if you didn't value a long life expectancy. By the 4th and 5th centuries, stability wasn't even an aspiration. It was a rumor. Imagine being a Roman citizen, listening to yet another proclamation, "We have a new emperor." And you quietly think, let me guess, he'll last 2 winters? Maybe 1, maybe half. The empire didn't fall in a single blow. It frayed inside out, thread by thread. The economy was out of breath. Rome's economy had once been a great engine, moving grain, gold, soldiers, resources, and goods across continents with the confidence of a machine that believed it would never fail. But machines need maintenance. Roads cracked, mines dried up, agriculture faltered, taxation grew messy. Coinage shrank in value. Trade routes became harder to protect. By the time the Vandals took North Africa, the empire's financial lungs were already wheezing. Ward Perkins points out that Roman economic life didn't decline suddenly. It thinned out quietly. Everyday items became cheaper in quality. Construction slowed, pottery weakened, tools regressed. People were living smaller lives with smaller means. Rome didn't go bankrupt overnight. It simply slid toward exhaustion, one ledger at a time. Civil wars drained the empire from the inside. While we often imagine dramatic battles with barbarians, many of Rome's most damaging conflicts were Romans fighting Romans. Goldsworthy wrote bluntly, "Rome died by suicide more than homicide." Every civil war bled the empire, not just in soldiers, but in loyalty, structure, trust, and stability. Every rebellion meant defensive walls left unguarded, Every rival general meant frontier troops abandoned their posts. Every political conflict meant money burned, resources wasted, provinces destabilized. While Rome fought itself, it ignored the whispers at its borders, the tribes gathering, shifting, watching. Rome didn't fall when the nomads arrived. Rome fell when it kept distracting itself with internal fires until there were no firefighters left. The nomadic tribes arrived late, like a final tap on a door that was already cracked. This is the part that often gets dramatized. The Goths crossing the Danube, the Huns pushing westward, the Vandals sailing to Africa, the Suebi and Burgundians settling in Gaul. But the truth is softer, gentler, and almost anticlimactic. The nomads didn't break Rome. They walked into spaces Rome had stopped holding. The empire, stretched thin, economically weakened, politically unstable, militarily hollow, simply didn't have the strength to push them out anymore. These wandering people didn't topple an empire in its prime. They settled into an empire too tired to resist. Imagine an old house with doors left open, not by sabotage, but by forgetfulness. The wind doesn't break in, it simply walks through. That's what the tribes did. They walked through. The sackings, the invasions, the conquests. They were often more like migrations, resettlements, negotiations, and frustrated alliances that went wrong. The nomads were the final push, not the cause, not the first blow, just the last one. Rome collapsed from within, and the nomads filled the empty space. Heather often emphasizes that the nomadic tribes didn't cause the collapse but shaped what came after. They didn't destroy the empire. They replaced it where it was already fading. They built kingdoms, adopted Roman law, continued Roman governance, preserved roads, cities, farms, and trade. The Western Empire didn't end in flames. It ended in transitions. One world grew dim, while another slowly lit its own lanterns. The Ostrogoths in Italy kept Roman administration alive. The Visigoths in Hispania preserved Roman law codes. The Franks in Gaul maintained cities and roads. The Vandals in Africa ran a surprisingly efficient kingdom. These weren't destroyers, they were successors, because the truth is simple: Rome didn't fall because of who arrived. Rome fell because of what was already missing. A quiet ending to a long story. As the night deepens, the ruins of Rome rest under the stars. No battles rage, no armies march, no emperors decree, only quiet. A quiet built not from chaos, but from centuries of slow decline finally reaching its last page. Civil wars drained it. The economy weakened it. Internal politics fractured it. And the nomads, arriving last, gave the final gentle nudge. Rome didn't slam shut. It simply closed like a tired book. If you listen closely to the night breeze passing through the old stones, the truth floats there faintly, softened by time. Empires rarely fall because of force. They fall because they forget to keep themselves standing. And Rome, grand, beautiful, magnificent, fell asleep long before anyone touched it. The night settles gently over the old Roman world, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Danube, from the quiet hills of Italy to the windswept plains of Gaul. In the soft darkness, the ruins of Rome look peaceful, columns standing like old friends, leaning on each other, broken arches whispering their memories into the wind, and silent roads stretching into the distance as if waiting for footsteps that no longer come. Rome, the empire, is gone, but Rome, the idea, is still very much alive. This is the strange, quiet truth that drifts through history. Empires die loudly, but their legacies linger softly. What Rome built, shaped, imagined, and preserved did not vanish with Odoacer or Alaric, or the Vandals, or any nomadic tribe that wandered across its final chapters. The empire may have fallen asleep in 476 CE, but its spirit stayed awake, quietly, patiently, woven into the fabric of the world that came after. And if you walk through the post-Roman night with open eyes, you can still see the glow of its influence everywhere. The law that never stopped speaking. Imagine a dusty Roman courthouse at dusk. The candles have burned low. The judges have gone home. The scrolls rest quietly on wooden tables. And yet the words inside those scrolls, Latin phrases about contracts, rights, responsibilities, citizenship, property, are not asleep. They never went to sleep. When Rome's political structure collapsed, its legal mind did not. Roman law was too clean, too logical, too practical, too deeply embedded in everyday life to disappear. And so, as barbarian kings set up new kingdoms across former Roman lands, they kept Roman law, not because they were sentimental, but because it worked. It solved disputes. It organized society. It gave consistency to courts and clarity to judges. Visigoths used it, Ostrogoths used it, Franks used parts of it, Byzantines refined it, medieval jurists revived it. Modern European legal systems absorbed it almost entirely. Even today, in cities that Rome never conquered, legal systems still carry old Roman bones. Concepts like contracts, torts, inheritance, citizenship, and property rights. If Rome were a ghost drifting through the night, the law would be its most lasting whisper, structured, calm, slightly annoyed when people misinterpret it. Latin never left the room. The empire fell, the emperors vanished, the legions disbanded, but Latin stayed. Latin is the patient ghost of Rome, the kind that doesn't rattle chains or slam doors, but simply sits in the corner and quietly insists, "I'm not done yet." In the twilight of the post-Roman world, Latin became the bridge between tribes, kings, clerics, merchants, scribes, and administrators. It was the language of the law, the courts, the documents, the trade agreements, the letters, the scribes' desks, the early universities, and even the street signs for a while. People spoke their own dialects, Proto-French, Proto-Spanish, Proto-Italian, the early forms of Portuguese and Romanian, but they wrote, negotiated, and organized in Latin. And as those dialects evolved, they didn't drift into something completely new. They grew from Latin soil, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, the Romance languages. Rome's children wandering through the centuries. Even English, which technically isn't one of the Romance languages, eventually became so stuffed with Latin-based vocabulary that modern English sentences sometimes feel like they were sprinkled with Roman seasoning for extra flavor. Every time someone says justice, structure, memory, nation, vision, family, honor, or future, they're unknowingly holding a Roman echo. Cities, roads, trade, and the bones of Europe. Picture an early medieval traveler walking at dusk. He follows a road, straight, efficient, stubbornly, continuing in a line through thick forests, because whoever built it didn't believe in going around anything unless absolutely necessary. That road is Roman. Most major European highways still follow Roman paths. He enters a small town. The layout feels oddly organized. 2 streets crossing, a central square, buildings arranged with a whisper of ancient logic. That structure is Roman. He stops at a stone bridge. Still sturdy, still useful. Probably built when someone named Marcus or Gaius supervised the construction. That bridge is Roman. Urban life didn't disappear when the empire collapsed. It slowed, dimmed, shifted. But the framework remained. Roman cities became medieval cities. Roman trade routes became medieval trade routes. Roman buildings became the bones around which new worlds formed. Even today, if you stand in Paris, Lyon, London, Cologne, Barcelona, Milan, Ravenna, or Trier, you stand in places shaped first by Roman hands. Rome didn't leave ruins. Rome left blueprints. A Europe that would not have existed without the fall. This is the part that surprises people. Europe as we know it exists because Rome fell. Not because Rome was destroyed by outsiders, but because Rome's absence created space for new identities to form. If Rome had stayed strong and intact, rigid, centralized, unchanging, the variety of medieval cultures, languages, and kingdoms might never have blossomed. Spain might not be Spain. France might not be France. Germany might not be Germany. Italy might have remained a Roman province, instead of becoming a patchwork of unique regions. The tribal settlements grew into kingdoms. The kingdoms grew into states. The states grew into modern nations. Europe took its shape not by filling Rome's presence, but by filling Rome's absence. The collapse was not just an ending, it was a release of energy, like a continent exhaling after centuries under a single heavy mantle. And from that exhale emerged a million different stories, languages, cultures, identities, and worlds that Rome, in all its order and structure, would never have allowed to flourish. Rome's quiet glow in the modern world. As the night deepens, you can see Rome everywhere if you look closely enough. A courthouse in France, shaped by principles first written in dusty Roman scrolls. A Spanish sentence whose roots lie in a soldier's Latin joke from 2,000 years ago. A Portuguese legal contract written with Roman terminology. A Romanian lullaby echoing ancient Latin rhythms. A highway in Britain following the line of an old Roman military road. A city plan in Italy still marked by the grid of a Roman castrum. A French word, an English word, an Italian word, each holding a trace of Roman breath. Rome is gone, yet not gone. Fallen, yet standing. Silent, yet still somehow speaking. Its armies sleep. Its emperors sleep. Its walls crumble peacefully under the moonlight. But its ideas, its language, its laws, its architecture, its city planning, its trade, its logic, its habits of organization, these things are still awake, softly awake, quietly awake, like the last embers of a long fire glowing under ash. The night whispers the simple truth. Rome did not vanish from the world. It transformed. It stopped being an empire of borders and became an empire of influence. It stopped marching with legions and began walking quietly through language, law, and memory. It stopped ruling through force and began guiding through its heritage. And as the night drifts across Europe, touching every country Rome once held and many it never reached, you can still feel the faint warmth of the old empire. Not as a conqueror, not as a ruler, not as a shadow, but as a foundation, a whisper, a blueprint, a quiet presence that shaped the modern world more deeply than any army could. Rome fell, and Rome remained. A paradox wrapped in moonlight, resting gently in the long sleep of history. The night drifts softly across the old Roman world, wrapping its quiet darkness around broken walls, silent roads, and lonely hilltops that once echoed with marching legions. Now everything rests. The empire that spent centuries expanding, negotiating, arguing, reorganizing, collapsing, and trying again has finally slipped into a gentle sleep. And in this soft quiet, something becomes beautifully clear. The end of Rome wasn't a crash. It was an exhale. When you walk through the silence, you can feel how the world didn't shatter when the empire faded. It simply shifted, like a heavy blanket being adjusted on a tired sleeper. New kingdoms stirred. New languages warmed the edges of old Latin. Towns changed hands, not through explosions, but through long, patient years of living and adapting. The nomadic tribes who once pressed Rome's borders didn't wake up intending to end an empire. They were families searching for food, safety, and places where winter didn't behave like it had a personal grudge. Their footsteps rewrote the map almost by accident, not with grand speeches or dramatic charges, but with movement, persistence, and the quiet logic of survival. And Rome, tired from centuries of holding itself together, simply didn't have the strength left to keep directing the world. But endings are not empty. They make space. As the empire dimmed, Europe began to glow in new ways. The Ostrogoths built a kingdom that still whispered Roman order. The Visigoths shaped laws that carried echoes of old Latin judges. The Franks grew patiently, steadily, into the framework of a future Europe. And the Vandals, after walking farther than any group reasonably should, built a maritime world in North Africa that hummed with trade and sunlight. Rome dissolved, but its pieces became seeds. You can still see them in the shape of cities, in the curve of old bridges, in half the words you speak without thinking. Rome didn't vanish. It reorganized itself into the world that came next. The night deepens now, soft and steady. No legions march, no emperors decree, no borders tremble. Only the gentle breathing of a world that has accepted its change. The slow-moving breeze carries the faint memory of togas, columns, arguments in the Senate, merchants shouting in marketplaces, and soldiers warming their hands beside campfires. These memories float through the darkness like tiny sparks drifting from a fire that has finally burned low. And somehow this quiet is comforting, because the truth is simple. Rome did not fall. Rome transformed. And like all things that outgrow themselves, it left behind traces. The kind you can still feel under your feet when you walk an old road, or hear in a language shaped by centuries, or touch in a stone worn smooth by time. The long night of Rome's ending is not tragic. It is peaceful, a slow closing of a very long story. And as the world slips deeper into this tranquil darkness, you can almost imagine the empire settling into its final rest. Not defeated, not broken, just finally allowed to be still. In the quiet, history exhales, and the night carries Rome's last whisper gently across the sleeping world.